Hi, and welcome to Formed. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Klein. I'm a professor here at the Augustine Institute, and I'm here today with my colleague, Dr. Carl Vennerstrom.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking about the 7 deadly sins. So this is the first episode in a series where we're going to be talking about this tradition of sort of categorizing the sins into the 7 deadly sins. And the reason why we thought this would be a good series to do is we thought it would help people examine their conscience more deeply and go to the sacrament of penance more fruitfully. So if you're anything like me, you might go to confession and list the same sins over and over again and feel like you're not making a lot of progress maybe in trying to discern why you're prone to those particular sins. So the 7 deadly sins are sort of categories that help us understand the motivations or the deeper image of sin in our lives so that we can help root it out. So in this episode, we're actually just going to talk about what the 7 deadly sins are and where this tradition comes from. So, Dr. Vennerstrom, what are the 7 deadly sins?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I am excited to talk about this, although, it's kind of strange to say you're excited to talk about the 7 deadly sins. It sounds like you have an appreciation for them in themselves, but yeah, I think they're fruitful things to discuss. So yeah, I think there's a couple places to start with trying to describe these sins. And in the first place, we could name 7. There are these different lists. So there's a good list in the Catechism. But we get a kind of variety. So in the beginning, there were 8. And it starts with this character named Evagrius of Pontus, who after his life, there's some, he wasn't appreciated by everyone, let's just say that. But in terms of his sort of more ethical theories, he's quite reliable.
Right. So Evagrius, the reason why Evagrius talks about this is Evagrius is a monastic figure.
Yeah.
So a lot of this kind of deeper discernment of sin and trying to really root out sin in your life, unsurprisingly, comes from people who are very focused on the life of virtue. And so that's the original thing, is from Evagrius, who is a monk. And can you tell us a little more about his time period and kind of what he's known for?
No, this is really important, I think. So he's from the 4th century. He didn't start out in Egypt, but he ended up in the Egyptian desert. And part of the reason for this categorization is that there was this sort of explosion of the monastic movement. These people who lived in remote locations and lived very ascetic lives. This means they didn't eat. They fasted quite strenuously, and they were celibate, and they tried to completely take themselves away from the pleasures and sins of the world in imitation of Christ going into the desert. And so as a result, they entered into this contest with demons, really, again, just like Christ. And so they thought it would be helpful, or at least Evagrius thought it would be helpful, to draw on the experience of a few generations of these monks who all encountered demons and temptations and grew and then fell. But to put these in a more sort of systematic fashion, so that as people were entering, they might be able to say, okay, so I'm experiencing this, but there's actually a kind of pattern for how this habitually works.
This is really interesting. So the 7 deadly sins were kind of seen as demons almost.
That's right.
In the sense that when you're entering into the life of virtue, you're going to be facing kind of attacks on your attempt, things that are trying to prevent you from fasting, from growing in holiness, from focusing on prayer. And even though we might be a little less comfortable with demons as kind of psychological category, I think in some ways it is still very helpful for us today in that it kind of helps maybe take the pressure off the idea that you're like fighting against yourself. Or like a dualistic tendency to think you have like a good angel and a bad angel.
Yeah.
Whereas rather to think about like it is really a contest against sin, which is something that's sort of separate from God's plan and separate from who you truly are. And so to kind of visualize it like they did as like these are the 7 like temptations that are like out to get you, or 7 or 8 temptations that are out to get you, I think is kind of helpful.
Yeah, that's really good. Just to add to that, I think it's helpful to think in terms of demons because I don't know. I think it's easy when you think about the ethical life. You're like, there's virtues and then there's vices. And I am going to sort of look at my day and I'm going to try to like make virtuous decisions instead of the vicious ones. But it's helpful to think about demons. And the other way he thought about was he called them thoughts, because it's not as neutral and simple as that. There's actually these powers working against you. And so if you can recognize their patterns and their attacks, you can actually arrive at virtue more successfully than if you just sort of think about it in a more basic way. It's actually like this contest, not just this straightforward path.
Yeah, and so it's more exciting.
Yeah, so it's more exciting.
And
yeah.
this is, it's interesting. I've thought about this before, that the monastics all in the 4th century, they seem to have a much clearer sense of spiritual combat or contest than even like regular people in the 4th century and us today. And there's something very interesting about the fact that like when you go out all by yourself and all the regular things of the world are taken away, it's like it's so much easier for you to see the devil's attacks and like the kinds of the like, sin in its nakedness and how ugly it is. And I think even though, you know, most of us are not going to go out into the desert, there's a kind of lesson there in that simplicity of life, and having detachment from those things can actually help you see more clearly that these things are not from God. These things are not like what are intended for me, and these other things are the way to go.
I think that's correct. And I think anyone who's gone very far into prayer, and especially contemplative forms of prayer, will know that often it's in those moments of silence when these darker parts of your character start to become clear.
Right.
It's not just this happy conversation with God, although that is certainly part of prayer, but it's also getting to a point of silence where it's possible to see all these things. And it also seems as though demons, I mean, this is what these monks teach, that when you're in the world, demons work more indirectly through other people or through they just have a lot more tools and they don't have to come like directly at you.
Right.
But if you kind of like clear the space either in prayer or like in completely moving your physical location to the desert, they don't have these other avenues.
You have the really cool imagery of the monks like invading the devil's territory. Like Anthony the Great, he goes out into the desert, and the devil's like, "What are you doing? This is my like."
This is my
it's almost
spot.
like this is the devil's house. Like he works in the city among the people. He goes home in the desert. So for Anthony to come out to him and like see him as he is, you know, where he's normally left alone. This is of course an image. I don't think the devil actually lives in the desert, but it's just stripping away all of the devil's illusions in the world is to see him like at home, and it's just a very cool image.
No, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, so what are how do you want to characterize the lists, or are there subcategories, or what are the 7 deadly sins?
Yeah, so I think you should think of the lists belonging to sort of 2 categories. There's a set of lists we could refer to as being more Eastern, and these start with temptations or sins like gluttony, lust, and avarice. These you could think of as being more bodily sins. So one way this is talked about by Thomas Aquinas is that with these earlier sins, and I think John Cashin talks in this way too, with these earlier sins, the demons have nature on their side. So they use your bodily desires against you, essentially. And then, so in the Eastern list, they move from those kind of sins gradually through sins of anger, and what we might call more emotional sins, maybe.
Okay.
So you have anger, you have sadness, you have what's called acedia or sloth, envy, and then the last 2 in these Eastern lists would be vainglory and pride, and these are more purely intellectual sins.
Okay.
What's interesting to someone like you, who's an Augustinian, is that when we get to Gregory the Great, also a monk, but in the West and influenced by Augustine, he flips the list. So there's pride as a kind of like the queen of the sins. So she's not included in the list. But then it begins with vainglory and envy and then moves backwards.
Okay. But so all the sins are kind of characterized in categories of like sins of the body, sins of the emotions or passions, and then sins of the mind. And then the East, they tend to be an ascending scale. On the West, a descending scale.
That's right. Yeah. So if you think about the Eastern sort of set, besides being a sort of list of sins, it's also a kind of itinerary for the spiritual life.
Okay.
So if you think about a monk entering a monastery, the first thing that would maybe be jarring to him is like he's eating so much less food.
Right.
And so the temptation to gluttony becomes more difficult.
Right. So it's like for a monastic spirituality, you kind of have to renounce those first 3 bodily sins almost immediately in a pretty stark way, because you're going to be celibate, you're not going to be eating very much, and you're not going to be making any money. So
Yeah.
poverty. Is the idea then in the Western list, if you go back down, is it kind of starting with the worst sins?
In a sense, yeah. So in the East, you would think of also the last sins being the most difficult. So vainglory and pride would be the hardest sins to eliminate from your soul.
Right.
Then in the West, pride, as I kind of said, would be this like archetypal sin. Like every sin
is pride in some sense.
is a form of pride. Yeah, and we can get into that more later. But yeah, so I think you would be starting in a sense with the more difficult sins, but also sins that are maybe more productive of other sins. So
right. So the West is kind of thinking of, well, first you have to understand what pride is to even understand what kind of sin is.
That's right.
Whereas the monastic emphasis in the East is like, well, first you have to renounce these sins, and then you kind of progress through the renunciation all the way until you get to pride. And I think for Evagrius, if you fail with spiritual pride, you just
go back to the beginning.
You go right back to the beginning. So
back to gluttony. Yeah, it's like chutes and
worst.
ladders or snakes and ladders or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, so something else I wanted to talk about with the 7 deadly sins is that they aren't actually sins in the sense that like gluttony isn't a particular act of sin, lust is an act of sin, pride isn't a particular act of sin, like theft is a sin or adultery is a sin. So why categorize them like this? It isn't like these are the 7 worst sins. It's not like murder, apostasy. These are the worst sins.
We gathered up all the sins and we picked the 7 worst ones. Yeah, this isn't the idea. No, and the question of sins is actually interesting. We've already said at first they were categorized as demons or even as thoughts. This is Evagrius, but then also as vices. So this is like this different language. It's this habit of the soul. And then when you get to Thomas Aquinas in his work on evil, he addresses this list of sins, and in each article he asks, is this a mortal sin?
Okay.
And so then he discusses if it's a mortal sin in kind, like as such, as a vice or as a sin, is it a sin? And he says that some are and then some aren't. But yeah, if you think in the earlier categories, these aren't sins so much as a set of categories for hanging other temptations or vices or sins. Yeah. So the reason they're all paired is because in a habitual or ordinary way, these would be the cause of other sins.
Right.
So, and it gets complicated because it's not as though this is how it works in every single instance. So especially the monastic authors think of gluttony as leading to lust, but it's not the only sin or vice that can lead to lust. You could get to lust from vainglory, or you could really move from any one of these to the other, but in the sort of experience of these monks and as the tradition gets refined, in the reflection on the moral life, people notice, okay, here's generally and in most cases
like which
how
sins are
related.
And I think that this is, although it might sound weird at first to say that the 7 deadly sins are not all mortal and are not all specific sins.
And they're not all deadly. These are not mortal sins.
They can all be called like capital vices, capital in the sense of like the head of other vices. And the reason I actually think this is very helpful for confession, even if it's not like some kind of rock solid, perfect way to talk about all sin, is that because specific sins can actually have different motivations. And I think that can be very helpful. So to take an extreme example, like murder could have the motivation of lust, or it could have the motivation of anger, or it could have the motivation of avarice. And obviously, if you murdered somebody, knowing the motive and the reason behind that would be a very important part of your penance and healing process. And that's true of all sins. That's an extreme example, but that's true of all sins. So if we find ourselves kind of confessing the exact same list of sins over and over again, it might be worth asking, okay, well, like, why is it, for example, that I constantly lose my patience with my children? Not that
Right.
this is a sin that either of us are
course,
familiar
no,
with at all.
I would never.
But like
Yeah.
what is it? Is it because of some, like, I'm wanting some kind of like bodily pleasure, like I'm wanting like more time to myself, more sleep, more, or is it because of like a lack of compassion, or is it because I feel like other people's children are better than mine, or there's all kinds of different ways, and they could be multiple motivations, but I think that's kind of like a helpful thing to think about.
Yeah, I think this is an extremely important element of this tradition, because you could be, we're going to sort of talk about these sins at times in the language of medicine and disease, and you could be going to confession and repeating these sins over and over again, and you could be genuinely sort of applying a cure that's like appropriate to a specific sin that you're committing, but there's this deeper disease that's just going to keep producing that other sin.
And that, like, the medicine analogy is helpful, because if you go to the doctor and you say, I'm having headaches and I can't sleep at night, then they're going to go through like a list and try to figure out what the underlying disease is, because treating the symptoms is only ever going to be a Band-Aid solution. Like, you actually want to find out kind of what the underlying disease is. So that's very helpful. So to kind of reiterate where we're at, there's lists of these capital vices or categories in which sins can fall. This starts with the monastic tradition in Egypt with Evagrius and 8 sins that are also called demons. But the list appears in lots of other different places. In the West, they're discussed by Gregory the Great, by Thomas Aquinas. You have a list in the Catechism. And they're all kind of aimed at the same idea of giving an overview of the temptations in the spiritual life and where you're likely to fall in the spiritual life. And then within the 7 or 8, they're usually categorized as kind of sins pertaining to different parts of the human person. So sins which appeal to your bodily desires or needs, sins which appeal to kind of your emotional or needs or your passions, and then sins that appeal to the intellect. And the sins pertaining to the intellect are unsurprisingly the highest sins, but often they're seen as kind of being gateway. Certain sins are gateway drugs to other sins, and this kind of thing going up and down the scale. Did you have anything else to add about our history of or categorization of the 7 deadly sins?
I just have one thing that kind of slipped through the cracks. When you talk about them as capital vices, I think that's kind of helpful. Like, that just means the sort of head vices, the like vices that are in charge. And so in Gregory the Great, in his Moralia on Job of all places, he describes these sort of like according to ranks. So the like head general of the army is Pride. And so Pride then sends out, we'll just like call them lieutenants. And the lieutenants would be like this, would be this list of 7 vices. And then each of those has their own sort of foot soldiers.
Okay.
So it's this sort of coherent hierarchy where, and it's a way of it's a way of categorizing them, but it's also a way of imagining them. So each is ruled by one, and all are ruled by Pride.
By Pride.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is really interesting. I actually did not know a whole lot about this tradition before Dr. Vennerstrom told me about it. And I'm looking forward to our next episodes where we're going to go through sort of each of the sins. We're going to talk about what the sin is, which part it appeals to. We're going to give some concrete examples of those sins. And then we're going to talk about the cure. So we didn't get to the cure part very much in this, but we're going to talk about the virtues that kind of pair with each vice, so that if this series does help you and you start to realize, oh, maybe this particular sin is something I'm struggling with, then we will not leave you hanging. We will give you ways to help combat that sin. So we hope to see you next time when we start covering the actual sins.